The Door to Infinity. Matt Carse knew he was being followed almost as soon as he left Madame Khan's. The laughter of the little dark women was still in his ears, and the fumes of Thil lay like a hot, sweet haze across his vision. But they did not obscure from him the whisper of sandaled feet close behind him in the chill Martian night. Carse quietly loosened his proton gun in its holster, but he did not attempt to lose his pursuer. He did not slow nor quicken his pace as he went through Jakara. The old town, he thought. That will be the best place. Too many people about here. Jakara was not sleeping despite the lateness of the hour. The low canal towns never sleep, for they lie outside the law, and time means nothing to them. In Jakara and Valkis and Barakesh, night is only a darker day. Carse walked beside the still black waters in their ancient channel, cut in the Dead Sea bottom. He watched the dry wind shake the torches that never went out, and listened to the broken music of the harps that were never stilled. Lean, lithe men and women passed him in the shadowy streets, silent as cats, except for the chime and the whisper of the tiny bells the women wear, a sound as delicate as rain, distillate of all the sweet wickedness of the world. They paid no attention to Carse, though despite his Martian dress, he was obviously an Earthman. And though an Earthman's life is usually less than the light of a snuffed candle along the low canals, Carse was one of them. The men of Jakara and Valkis and Barakesh are the aristocracy of thieves, and they admire skill and respect knowledge, and know a gentleman when they meet one. That was why Matthew Carse, ex-fellow of the Interplanetary Society of Archaeologists, ex-assistant of the Chair of Martian Antiquities of Kahora, dweller on Mars for 30 of his 35 years, had been admitted to their far more exclusive society of thieves, and had sworn with them the oath of friendship that may not be broken. Yet now, through the streets of Jakara, one of Carse's friends was stalking him with all the cunning of a sandcat. He wondered momentarily whether the Earth Police Control might have sent an agent here looking for him, and immediately discarded that possibility. Agents of anybody's police did not live in Jakara. No, it was some low canaler on business of his own. Carse left the canal, turning his back on the Dead Sea bottom and facing what had once been inland. The ground rose sharply to the upper cliffs, much gnawed and worn by time and the eternal wind. The old city brooded there, the ancient stronghold of the Sea Kings of Jakara, its glory long stripped from it by the dropping of the sea. The new town of Jakara, the living town down by the canal, had been old when of the Chaldees was a raw young village. Old Jakara, with its docks of stone and marble still standing in the dry and dust-choked harbor, was old beyond any Earth conception of the word. Even Carse, who knew as much about it as any living man, was always awed by it. He chose now to go this way because it was utterly dead and deserted, and a man might be alone to talk to his friend. The empty houses lay open to the night. Time and the scouring wind had worn away their corners and the angles of their doorways, smoothed them into the blurred and weary land. The little low moons made a tangle of conflicting shadows among them. With no effort at all, the tall Earthman, in his long dark cloak, blended into the shadows and disappeared. Crouched in the shelter of a wall, he listened to the footsteps of the man who followed him. They grew louder, quickened, slowed indecisively, then quickened again. They drew abreast, passed, and suddenly, Carse had moved in a great cat-like spring out into the street, and a small, wiry body was writhing in his grasp, mewing with fright as it shrank from the icy jabbing of the proton gun in its side.
"No!"
it squealed.
"Don't! I have no weapon. I mean no harm. I want only to talk to you."
Even through the fear, a note of cunning crept into his voice.
"I have a gift."
Kars assured himself that the man was unarmed, and then relaxed his grip. He could see the Martian quite clearly in the moonlight, a rat-like small thief, and an unsuccessful one from the worn kilt and harness and the lack of ornaments. The dregs and sweepings of the low canals produced such men as this, and they were brothers to the stinging worms that kill furtively out of the dust. Kars did not put his gun away. "Go ahead," he said. "Talk."
"First," said the Martian, "I am Pen-Kor of Marrakesh. You may have heard of me."
He strutted at the sound of his own name like a shabby bantam rooster. "No," said Kars, "I haven't." His tone was like a slap in the face. Pen-Kor gave a snarling grin.
"No matter. I have heard of you, Kars. As I said, I have a gift for you, a most rare and valuable gift."
"Something so rare and valuable that you had to follow me in the darkness to tell me about it, even in Jakara." Kars frowned at Pen-Kor, trying to fathom his duplicity. "Well, what is it?"
"Come, and I'll show you."
"Where is it?"
"Hidden. Well hidden up near the palace keys."
Kars nodded. "Something too rare and valuable to be carried or shown even in a thieves' market. You intrigue me, Pen-Kor. We will go and look at your gift." Pen-Kor showed his pointed teeth in the moonlight and led off. Kars followed. He moved lightly, poised for instant action. His gun hand swung loose and ready at his side. He was wondering what sort of price Pen-Kor of Marrakesh planned to ask for his gift. As they climbed upward toward the palace, scrambling over worn reefs and along cliff faces that still showed the erosion of the sea, Kars had, as always, the feeling that he was climbing a sort of ladder into the past. It turned him cold with a queer shivering thrill to see the great docks still standing, marked with a mooring of ships. In the eerie moonlight, one can almost imagine. "In here," said Pen-Kor. Kars followed him into a dark huddle of crumbling stone. He took a little krypton lamp from his belt pouch and touched it to a glow. Pen-Kor knelt and scrambled among the broken stones of the floor until he brought forth a long, thin bundle wrapped in rags. With a strange reverence, almost with fear, he began to unwrap it. Kars knelt beside him. He realized that he was holding his breath, watching the Martian's lean, dark hands, waiting. Something in the man's attitude had caught him into the same taut mood. The lamplight struck a spark of deep fire from a half-covered jewel, and then a clean brilliance of metal. Kars leaned forward. Pen-Kor's eyes, slanted wolf eyes, yellow as topaz, glanced up and caught the Earthman's hard blue gaze, held it for a moment, then shifted away. Swiftly he drew the last covering from the object on the floor. Kars did not move. The thing lay bright and burning between them, and neither man stirred nor seemed even to breathe. The red glow of the lamp painted their faces, lean bone above iron shadows, and the eyes of Matthew Kars were the eyes of a man who looks upon a miracle. After a long while, he reached out and took the thing into his hands. The beautiful and deadly slimness of it, the length and perfect balance, the black hilt and guard that fitted perfectly his large hand, the single smoky jewel that seemed to watch him with a living wisdom. The name etched in most rare and most ancient symbols upon the blade. He spoke, and his voice was no more than a whisper. "The sword of Rhiannon." Pencor let out his breath in a sharp sigh. "I found it," he said. "I found it." Carr said, "Where?" "It does not matter where. I found it. It is yours, for a small price." A small price. Carr smiled. A small price for the sword of a god. "An evil god," muttered Pencor. "For more than 1,000,000 years, Mars has called him the Cursed One." "I know," Kars nodded. "Rhiannon, the Cursed One, the Fallen One, the Rebel One of the gods of long ago. I know the legend, yes. The legend of how the old gods conquered Rhiannon and thrust him into a hidden tomb." Pencor looked away. He said, "I know nothing of any tomb." "You lie," Kars told him softly. "You found the tomb of Rhiannon, or you could not have found his sword. You found, somehow, the key to the oldest sacred legend on Mars. The very stones of that place are worth their weight in gold to the right people." "I found no tomb," Pencor insisted sullenly. He went on quickly. "But the sword itself is worth a fortune. I daren't try to sell it. These Jakarans would snatch it away from me like wolves if they saw it. But you can sell it, Kars." The little thief was shivering in the urgency of his greed. "You can smuggle it to Kahora and sell it to some Earthman for a fortune." "And I will," Kars nodded. "But first, we will get the other things in that tomb." Pencor had a sweat of agony on his face. After a long time, he whispered, "Leave it at the sword, Kars. That's enough." It came to Kars that Pencor's agony was blended of greed and fear. And it was not fear of the Jakarans, but of something else. Something that would have to be awesome indeed to daunt the greed of Pencor. Kars swore contemptuously. "Are you afraid of the Cursed One? Afraid of a mere legend that time has woven around some old king who's been a ghost for 1,000,000 years?" He laughed and made the sword flash in the lamplight. "Don't worry, little one. I'll keep the ghosts away. Think of the money. You can have your own palace with 100 lovely slaves to keep you happy." He watched fear struggle again with greed in the Martian's face. "I saw something there, Kars. Something that scared me. I don't know why." Greed won out. Pencor licked dry lips. "But perhaps, as you say, it is all only legend, and there are treasures there. Even my half share of them would make me wealthy beyond dreams." "Half," Kars repeated blandly. "You're mistaken, Pencor. Your share will be 1/3. Pencor's face distorted with fury, and he leaped up. "But I found the tomb. It's my discovery." Kars shrugged. "If you'd rather not share that way, then keep your secret to yourself. Keep it till your brothers of Jakara tear it from you with hot pincers when I tell them what you've found." "You'd do that?" choked Pencor. "You'd tell them and get me killed?" The little thief stared in impotent rage at Kars, standing tall in the lampglow with a sword in his hands, his cloak falling back from his naked shoulders, his collar and belt of jewels looted from a dead king flaring. There was no softness in Kars, no relenting. the deserts and the suns of Mars, the cold and the heat and the hunger of them, had flayed away all but the bone and the iron sinew. Pancor shivered. "Very well, Kars. I'll take you there, for 1/3 share." Kars nodded and smiled. "I thought you would." 2 hours later, they were riding up into the dark, time-worn hills that loomed behind Jakara and the Dead Sea bottom. It was very late now, an hour that Kars loved, because it seemed then that Mars was most perfectly itself. It reminded him of a very old warrior, wrapped in a black cloak and holding a broken sword, dreaming the dreams of age which are so close to reality, remembering the sound of trumpets and the laughter and the strength. The dust of the ancient hills whispered under the eternal wind Phobos had set, and the stars were coldly brilliant. The lights of Jakara and the great black blankness of the Dead Sea bottom lay far behind and below them now. Pancor led the way up the ascending gorges, their ungainly mounts picking their way with astonishing agility over the treacherous ground. "This is how I stumbled on the place," Pancor said. "On a ledge, my beast broke its leg in a hole, and the sand widened the hole as it flowed inward. And there was the tomb, cut right into the rock of the cliff. But the entrance was choked when I found it." He turned and fixed Kars with a sulky yellow stare. "I found it," he repeated. "I still don't see why I should give you the lion's share." "Because I'm the lion," said Kars cheerfully. He made passes with the sword, feeling it blend with his flexing wrist, watching the starlight slide down the blade. His heart was beating high with excitement, and it was the excitement of the archaeologist as well as of the looter. He knew better than Pancor the importance of this find. Martian history is so vastly long that it fades back into a dimness from which only vague legends have come down. Legends of human and half-human races, of forgotten wars, of vanished gods. Greatest of those gods had been the Quiru, hero gods who were human yet superhuman, who had had all wisdom and power. But there had been a rebel among them, dark Rhiannon, the cursed one, whose sinful pride had caused some mysterious catastrophe. The Quiru, said the myths, had for that sin crushed Rhiannon and locked him into a hidden tomb. And for more than 1,000,000 years, men had hunted the tomb of Rhiannon because they believed it held the secrets of Rhiannon's power. Kars knew too much archaeology to take old legends too seriously. But he did believe that there was an incredibly ancient tomb that had engendered all these myths. And as the oldest relic on Mars, it, and the things in it, would make Matthew Kars the richest man on 3 worlds, if he lived. "This way," said Pancor abruptly. He had ridden in silence for a long time, brooding. They were far up in the highest hills behind Jakara. Kars followed the little thief along a narrow ledge on the face of a steep cliff. Pancor dismounted and rolled aside a large stone, disclosing a hole in the cliff that was big enough for a man to wriggle through. "You first," said Kars. "Take the lamp." Reluctantly, Pancor obeyed, and Kars followed him into the foxhole. At first, there was only an utter darkness beyond the glow of the krypton lamp. Pancor slunk, cringing now like a frightened jackal. Kars snatched the lamp away from him and held it high. They had scrambled through the narrow foxhole into a corridor that led straight back into the cliff. It was square and without ornament, the stone beautifully polished. He started off along it, Pencore following. The corridor ended in a vast chamber. It, too, was square and magnificently plain from what Kars could see of it. There was a dais at one end with an altar of marble, upon which was carved the same symbol that appeared on the hilt of the sword, the Ouroboros, in the shape of a winged serpent. But the circle was broken, the head of the serpent lifted as though looking into some new infinity. Pencore's voice came in a reedy whisper from behind his shoulder. "It was here that I found the sword. There are other things around the room, but I did not touch them." Kars had already glimpsed objects ranging around the walls of the great chamber, glittering vaguely through the gloom. He hooked the lamp to his belt and started to examine them. Here was treasure indeed. There were suits of mail of the finest workmanship, blazoned with patterns of unfamiliar jewels. There were strangely shaped helmets of unfamiliar glistening metals. A heavy throne-like chair of gold, subtly inlaid in dark metal, and it had a big tawny gem burning in each armpost. All these things, Kars knew, were incredibly ancient. They must come from the farthest part of Mars. "Let us hurry," Pencore pleaded. Kars relaxed and grinned at his own forgetfulness. The scholar in him had for the moment superseded the looter. "We'll take all we can carry of the smaller jeweled things," he said. "This first haul alone will make us rich." "But you'll be twice as rich as I," Pencore said sourly. "I could have got an Earthman in Marrakesh to sell these things for me for a half share only." Kars laughed. "You should have done so, Pencore. When you ask for help from a noted specialist, you have to pay high fees." His circuit of the chamber had brought him back to the altar. Now he saw that behind the altar lay a door. He went through it, Pencore following reluctantly at his heels. Beyond the doorway was a short passage, and at the end of it a door of metal, small and heavily barred. The bars had been lifted, and the door stood open an inch or two. Above it was an inscription in the ancient, changeless, high Martian characters, which Kars read with practiced ease. "The doom of Rhiannon, dealt unto him forever by the Quiru, who are lords of space and time." Kars pushed the metal door aside and stepped through. And then he stood quite still, looking. Beyond the door was a great stone chamber, as large as the one behind him. But in this room, there was only one thing. It was a great bubble of darkness, a big brooding sphere of quivering blackness, through which shot little coruscating particles of brilliance, like falling stars seen from another world. And from this weird bubble of throbbing darkness, the lamplight recoiled, afraid. Something, awe, superstition, or some purely physical force, sent a cold, tingling shock racing through Kars's body. He felt his hair rising, and his flesh seemed to draw away from his bones. He tried to speak, and could not. His throat knotted with anxiety and tension. "This is the thing I told you of," whispered Pencore. "This is the thing I told you I saw." Kars hardly heard him. A conjecture so vast that he could not grasp it shook his brain. The scholar's ecstasy was upon him, the ecstasy of discovery, that is akin to madness. This brooding bubble of darkness, it was strangely like the darkness of those lank black spots far out in the galaxy, which some scientists have dreamed are holes in the continuum itself, windows into the infinite outside our universe. Incredible, surely, and yet that cryptic Quiru inscription. fascinated by the thing, despite its aura of danger. Karst took 2 steps toward it. He heard the swift scrape of sandals on the stone floor behind him as Pencor moved fast. Karst knew instantly that he had blundered in turning his back on the disgruntled little thief. He started to whirl and raise the sword. Pencor's thrusting hands jabbed his back before he could complete the movement. Karst felt himself pitched into the brooding blackness. He felt a terrible rending shock through each atom of his body, and then the world seemed to fall away from him. "Go share Rhiannon's doom, Earthman! I told you I could get another partner!" Pencor's snarling shout came to him from a great distance as he tumbled into a black, bottomless infinity. 2. Alien World. Karst seemed to plunge through a nighted abyss, buffeted by all the shrieking winds of space. An endless, endless fall, with the timelessness and the choking horror of a nightmare. He struggled with the fierce revulsion of an animal trapped by the unknown. His struggle was not physical, for in that blind and screaming nothingness, his body was useless. It was a mental fight, the man's inner core of courage reasserting itself, willing itself to stop this nightmare fall through darkness. And then, as he fell, a more terrifying sensation shook him. A feeling that he was not alone in this nightmare plunge through infinity, that a dark, strong, pulsating presence was close behind him, grasping for him, groping with eager fingers for his brain. Karst made a supreme, desperate mental effort. His sensation of falling seemed to lessen, and then he felt solid rock slipping under his hands and feet. He scrambled frantically forward, in physical effort this time. He found himself quite suddenly outside the dark bubble again, on the floor of the inner chamber of the tomb. "What in the 9 hells?" he began shakily, and then stopped because the oath seemed so pitifully inadequate for what had happened. The little krypton lamp hooked to his belt still cast its reddish glow. The sword of Rhiannon still glittered in his hand. And the bubble of darkness still gloomed and brooded a foot away from him, flickering with its whirl of diamond motes. Karst realized that all his nightmare plunging through space had been during the moment he was inside the bubble. What devil's trick of ancient science was the thing anyway? Some queer perpetual vortex of force that the mysterious Quiru of long ago had set up, he supposed. But why had he seemed to fall through infinities inside the thing? And whence had come that terrifying sensation of strong fingers groping eagerly at his brain as he fell? "A trick of old Quiru science," he muttered shakenly. "And Pencor's superstitions made him think he could kill me by pushing me into it." Pencor? Karst leaped to his feet, the sword of Rhiannon glittering wickedly in his hand. Blast his thieving little soul! Pencor was not here now, but he wouldn't have had time to go far. The smile on Karst's face was not pleasant as he went through the doorway. In the outer chamber, he suddenly stopped dead. There were things here now, big, strange, glittering objects that had not been here before. Where had they come from? Had he been longer in that bubble of darkness than he thought? Had Pencor found these things in hidden crypts and ranged them here to await his return? Karst's wonder increased as he examined the objects that now loomed amid the mail and other relics he had seen before. These objects did not look like mere art relics. They looked like carefully fashioned, complicated instruments of unguessable purpose. The biggest of them was a crystal wheel, the size of a small table, mounted horizontally atop a dull metal sphere. The The wheel's rim glistened with jewels cut in precise polyhedrons. And there were other, smaller devices of linked crystal prisms and tubes, and things built of concentric metal rings and squat looped tubes of massive metal. Could these glittering objects be the incomprehensible devices of an ancient alien Martian science? That supposition seemed incredible. The Mars of the far past, scholars knew, had been a world of only rudimentary science, a world of sword-fighting sea warriors whose galleys and kingdoms had clashed on long-lost oceans. Yet perhaps, in the Mars of the even farther past, there had been a science whose techniques were unfamiliar and unrecognizable. But where could Pencor have found them when we didn't see them before? And why didn't he take any of them with him? Memory of Pencor reminded him that the little thief would be getting farther away every moment. Grimly gripping the sword, Kars turned and hurried down the square stone corridor toward the outer world. As he strode on, Kars became aware that the air in the tomb was now strangely damp. Moisture glistened on the walls. He had not noticed that most un-Martian dampness before, and it startled him. Probably seepage from underground springs, like those that feed the canals, he thought. But it wasn't there before. His glance fell on the floor of the corridor. The drifted dust lay over it thickly when they had entered. But there were no footprints in it now. No prints at all except those he was now making. A horrible doubt, a feeling of unreality, clawed at Kars. The un-Martian dampness, the vanishing of their footprints. What had happened to everything in the moment he'd been inside the dark bubble? He came to the end of the square stone corridor, and it was closed. It was closed by a massive slab of monolithic stone. Kars stopped, staring at the slab. He fought down his increasing sense of weird unreality and made explanation for himself. There must have been a stone door I didn't see, and Pencor has closed it to lock me in. He tried to move the slab. It would not budge, nor was there any sign of key, knob, or hinge. Finally, Kars stepped back and leveled his proton pistol. Its hissing streak of atomic flame crackled in the rock slab, searing and splitting it. The slab was thick. He kept the trigger of his gun depressed for minutes. Then, with a hollowly reverberating crash, the fragments of the split slab fell back in toward him. But beyond, instead of the open air, there lay a solid mass of dark red soil. The whole tomb of Rhiannon. Buried now. Pencor must have started a cave-in. Kars didn't believe that. He didn't believe it at all, but he tried to make himself believe, for he was becoming more and more afraid. And the thing of which he was afraid was impossible. With blind anger, he used the flaming beam of the pistol to undercut the mass of soil that blocked his way. He worked outward until the beam suddenly died as the charge of the gun ran out. He flung away the useless pistol and attacked the hot, smoking mass of soil with the sword. Panting, dripping, his mind a whirl of confused speculations, he dug outward through the soft soil till a small hole of brilliant daylight opened in front of him. Daylight? Then he'd been in the weird bubble of darkness longer than he had imagined. The wind blew in through the little opening upon his face, and it was a warm wind. A warm wind and a damp wind, such as never blows on desert Mars. Kars squeezed through and stood in the bright day looking outward. There are times when a man has no emotion, no reaction. Times when all the centers are numbed, and the eyes see and the ears hear, but nothing communicates itself to the brain, which is protected in this way from madness. He tried finally to laugh at what he saw. though he heard his own laughter as a dry, choking cry.
"Mirage, of course," he whispered. "A big mirage. Big as all Mars."
The warm breeze lifted Karst's tawny hair, blew his cloak against him. A cloud drifted over the sun, and somewhere a bird screamed harshly. He did not move. He was looking at an ocean. It stretched out to the horizon ahead, a vast restlessness of water, milky white and pale with a shimmering phosphorescence, even in daylight.
"Mirage,"
he said again stubbornly, his reeling mind clinging with the desperation of fear to that one shred of explanation.
"It has to be, because this is still Mars."
Still Mars. Still the same planet. The same high hills up into which Pencor had led him by night.
Or were they the same?
Before, the foxhole entrance to the tomb of Rhiannon had been in a steep cliff face. Now he stood on the grassy slope of a great hill. And there were rolling green hills and dark forests down there below him, where before had been only desert. Green hills, green wood, and a bright river that ran down a gorge to what had been dead sea bottom, but was now sea. Karst's numbed gaze swept along the great coast of the distant shoreline. And down on that far sunlight coast, he saw the glitter of a white city, and knew that it was Jakara. Jakara, bright and strong between the verdant hills and the mighty ocean, that ocean that had not been seen upon Mars for nearly 1,000,000 years. Matthew Karst knew then that it was no mirage. He sat and hid his face in his hands. His body was shaken by deep tremors, and his nails bit into his own flesh until blood trickled down his cheeks. He knew now what had happened to him in that vortex of darkness, and it seemed to him that a cold voice repeated a certain warning inscription in tones of distant thunder. "The Quiru are lords of space and time. Of time. Of time." Karst, staring out over the green hills and the milky ocean, made a terrible effort to grapple with the incredible. "I have come into the past of Mars. All my life I have studied and dreamed of that past. Now I am in it. I, Matthew Karst, archaeologist, renegade, looter of tombs. The Quiru, for their own reasons, built a way, and I came through it. Time is to us the unknown dimension, but the Quiru knew it." Karst had studied science. You had to know the elements of a half-dozen sciences to be a planetary archaeologist. He frantically ransacked memory now for an explanation. Had his first guess about that bubble of darkness been right? Was it really a hole in the continuum of the universe? If that were so, he could dimly understand what had happened to him. For the space-time continuum of the universe was finite, limited. Einstein and Riemann had proved that long ago. And he had fallen clear out of that continuum and then back into it again, but into a different time frame from his own. What was it that Kaufman had once written? The past is the present that exists at a distance. He had come back into the other distant present. That was all. There was no reason to be afraid. But he was afraid. The horror of that nightmare transition to this green and smiling Mars of long ago wrenched a gusty cry from his lips. Blindly, still gripping the jeweled sword, he leaped up and turned to re-enter the buried tomb of Rhiannon. "I can go back the way I came, back through that hole in the continuum." He stopped, a convulsive shudder running through his frame. He could not make himself face again that bubble of glittering gloom, that dreadful plunge through interdimensional infinity. He dared not. He had not the Quiru's wisdom. In that perilous plunge across time, mere chance had flung him into his past age. He could not count on chance to return him to his own far future age. "I'm here," he said. "I'm here in the distant past of Mars, and I'm here to stay." He turned back around and gazed out again upon that incredible vista. He stayed there a long time, unmoving. The seabirds came and looked at him and flashed away on their sharp white wings. The shadows lengthened. His eyes swung again to the white towers of Jakara down in the distance, queenly in the sunlight above the harbor. It was not the Jakara he knew, the thieves' city of the low canals, rotting away into dust, but it was a link to the familiar, and Karst desperately needed such a link. He would go to Jakara, and he would try not to think. He must not think at all, or surely his mind would crack. Karst gripped the haft of the jeweled sword and started down the grassy slope of the hill. 3. City of the Past. It was a long way to the city. Karst moved at a steady, plodding pace. He did not try to find the easiest path, but rammed his way through and over all obstacles, never deviating from the straight line that led to Jakara. His cloak hampered him, and he tore it off. His face was empty of all expression, but sweat ran down his cheeks and mingled with the salt of tears. He walked between two worlds. He went through valleys, drowsing in the heat of the summer day, where leafy branches of strange trees raked his face, and the juice of crushed grasses stained his sandals. Life, winged and furred and soft of foot, fled from him with a stir and a rustle. And yet he knew that he walked in a desert, where even the wind had forgotten the names of the dead for whom he mourned. He crossed high ridges, where the sea lay before him, and he could hear the boom of the surf on the beaches. And yet he saw only a vast dead plain, where the dust ran in little wavelets among the dry reefs. The truths of 30 years living are not easily forgotten. The sun sank slowly toward the horizon. As Karst topped the last ridge above the city and started down, he walked under a vault of flame. The sea burned as the white phosphorescence took color from the clouds. With dazed wonder, Karst saw the gold and crimson and purple splash down the long curve of the sky and run out over the water. He could look down under the harbor. The docks of marble that he had known so well, worn and cracked by ages and whelmed by desert sand, lying lonely beneath the moons. The same docks, and yet now, mirage-like, the sea filled the basin of the harbor. Round-hulled trading ships lay against the quays, and the shouts of stevedores and sweating slaves rose up to him on the evening air. Shallops came and went amid the ships, and out beyond the breakwater he saw the fishing fleet of Jakara coming home with sails of cinnabar dark against the west. By the palace quays, near the very spot where he had gone with Pencour to see the sword of Rhiannon, a long, lean, dark war galley with a brazen ram crouched like a sullen black panther. Beyond it were other galleys, and above them, tall and proud, the white towers of the palace rose. I have come far back into the past of Mars, indeed. For this is the Mars of 1,000,000 years ago that archaeology has always pictured. A planet of conflicting civilizations, which had developed little science, yet which cherished a legend of the super-science of the great Quiru, who had been before even this time. A planet of the lost past that God's laws intended no man of my own time ever to see. Matthew Carr shivered as though it were very cold. Slowly, slowly, he went down into the streets of Jakara, and it seemed to him, in the sunset, that the whole city was stained with blood. The walls closed him in. There was a mist before his eyes and a roaring in his ears, but he was aware of people. Lean, lithe men and women who passed him in the narrow ways, who jostled against him and went on, then stopped and turned to stare. The dark and cat-like people of Jakara, Jakara of the low canals, and of this other age. He heard the music of the harps and the chiming whisper of the little bells the women wore. The wind touched his face, but it was a moist wind and warm, heavy with the breath of the sea, and it was more than a man could bear. Karst went on, but he had no idea where he was going or what he had to do. He went on only because he was already moving, and he had not the wit to stop. One foot before the other, stolid, blind, like a man bewitched, he walked through the streets among the dark Jakarans, a tall, blond man trailing a naked sword. The people of the city watched him, people of the harbor side, of the wine shops and the twisting alleys. They drew away before and closed in behind, following and staring at him. The gap of ages lay between them. His kilt was of a strange cloth, an unknown dye. His ornaments were of a time and country they would never see. His face was alien. This very alienage held him back for a time. Some breath of the incredible truth clung to him and made them afraid. Then someone said a name, and someone else repeated it, and in the space of a few seconds, there was no more mystery, no more fear, only hate. Karst heard the name, dimly, from a great distance. He heard it as it grew from a whisper into a howling cry that ran wolf-like through the streets. "Khand! Khand! A spy from Condor!" And then another word. "Slay!" The name of Khand meant nothing to Karst, but he recognized it for what it was, an epithet and a curse. The voice of the mob carried to him the warning of death, and he tried to rouse himself, for the instinct of survival is strong. But his brain was numbed and would not wake. A stone struck him on the cheek. The physical shock brought him to a little. Blood ran into his mouth. The salt, sweet taste of it told him the destruction had already begun. He tried to shake the dark veils aside, far enough at least to see the enemy that threatened him. He had come out into an open space by the docks. Now, in the twilight, the sea flamed with cold white fire. Masts of the moored ships stood black against it. Phobos was rising, and in the mingled light, Karst saw that there were the creatures climbing into the rigging of the ships, and that they were furred and chained, and not wholly human. And he saw on the wharf side 2 slender white-skinned men with wings. They wore the loincloth of the slave, and their wings were broken. The square was filled with people. More of them poured in from the narrow alley mouths, drawn by the shout of "Spy!" It echoed from the buildings, and the name of Condor hammered at him. From the wharf side, from the winged slaves and the chained creatures of the ships, a fervent cry reached him. "Hail, Condor! Fight, man!" Women screamed like harpies. Another stone whistled past his ear. The mob surged and jostled, but those nearest Karst held back, wary of the great jeweled sword with its shining blade. Karst shouted. He swung the sword in a humming arc around him, and the Jakarans, who had shorter blades, melted back. Again from the wharf side he heard, "Hail, Condor! Down with the serpent! Down with Sark! Fight, Khand!" He knew that the slaves would have helped him if they could. One part of his mind was beginning to function now. the part that had to do with a long experience in saving his own neck. He was only a few paces away from the buildings at his back. He whirled and leaped suddenly, the bright steel swinging. It bit twice into flesh, and then he had gained the doorway of a ship's chandler, so that they could only come at him from the front. A small advantage, but every second a man could stay alive was a second gained. He made a flickering barrier of steel before him, and then bellowed, in their own high Martian, "Wait! I am no Khond!" The crowd broke into jeering laughter. "He says he is not of Condor! Your own friends hail you, Khond! Hark to the swimmers and the sky folk!" Kars cried, "No, I am not of Condor! I am not!" He stopped short. He had almost said he was not of Mars. A green-eyed girl, hardly more than a child, darted almost into the circle of death he wove before him. Her teeth showed white as a rat's. "Coward!" she screamed. "Fool! Where but in Condor do they breed men like you, with pale hair and sickly skin? Where else could you be from, O clumsy thing with a barbarous speech?" Something of a strange look returned to Kars's face, and he said, "I am from Jakara." They laughed. They shrieked with laughter until the square rocked with it. Now they had lost all awe of him. His every word stamped him as what the girl had called him, a coward and a fool. Almost contemptuously, they attacked. This was real enough to Kars. This mass of hate-filled faces and wicked short swords coming at him. He struck out ragingly with the long sword of Rhiannon, his rage less against this murderous rabble than against the fate that had pitchforked him into their world. Several of them died on the jeweled sword, and the rest drew back. They stood glaring at him like jackals who have trapped a wolf. Then, through their hissing, came an exultant cry. "The Sark soldiers are coming! They'll cut down this Khond spy for us!" Kars, backed against a locked door and panting, saw a little phalanx of black-mailed, black-helmeted warriors pushing through the rabble like a ship through waves. They were coming straight toward him, and the Jakarans were already yelling in eager anticipation of the kill. 4. Perilous Secret. The door against which Kars's back was braced suddenly gave way, opening inward. He reeled backward into the black interior. As he staggered for balance, the door suddenly slammed shut again. He heard a bar fall, and then a low, throaty chuckle from beside him. "That will hold them for a while, but we'd better get you out of here quickly, Khond. Those Sark soldiers will cut the door open." Kars swung around, his sword raised, but was blind in the darkness of the room. He could smell rope and tar and dust, but could see nothing. A frantic hammering began outside the door. Then Kars's eyes, becoming accustomed to the obscurity, made out a ponderous, corpulent figure close beside him. The man was big, fleshy, and soft-looking. A Martian who wore a kilt that looked ridiculously scanty on his fat figure. His face was moon-like, creased and crinkled in a reassuring grin, as his small eyes looked unfearingly at Kars's raised sword. "I'm no Jakaran or Sark either," he said reassuringly. "I'm Bagaz Hoy of Valkus, and I've my own reasons for helping any man of Khond. But we'll have to go quickly." "Go where?" Kars had to drag the words out. He was still breathing so painfully. "To a place of safety." The other paused as new louder hammering began upon the door. "That's the Sarks. I'm leaving. Come or stay as you like, Khond." He turned toward the back of the dark room, moving with astonishing lightness and ease for one so corpulent. He did not look back to see if Kars was following. But there was really no choice for Kars. Half dazed as he still was, he was of no mind to face the eruption of those mailed soldiers and the Jakaran rabble. He followed Bagaz Hoy. The Valkesian chuckled as he squeezed his bulk through a small open window at the rear of the room. I know every rat hole in this harbour quarter. That's why, when I saw you backed against the old Taurus Thor's door, I simply went around through and let you in. Snatched you from under their noses. But why? Kars asked again. I told you, I have a sympathy for Khans. They're men enough to snap their fingers at Sark and the damned serpent. I help one when I can. It didn't make any sense to Kars. But how could it? How could he know anything of the hates and passions of this Mars of the remote past? He was trapped in this strange Mars of long ago, and he had to grope his way in it like an ignorant child. It was certain that the mob out there had tried to kill him. They had taken him for a Khand. Not the Jakaran rabble alone, but those strange slaves, the semi-humans with the broken wings, the furred, sleek-chained creatures who had cheered him from the galleys. Kars shivered. Until now, he had been too dazed to think of the strangeness of those not quite human slaves. And who were the Khans? This way, Bagaz Hoy interrupted his thoughts. They had threaded a shadowy little labyrinth of stinking alleys, and the fat Valkesian was squeezing through a narrow door in the dark interior of a little hut. Kars followed him inside. He heard the whistle of the blow in the dark and tried to dodge, but there was no time. The concussion exploded a bomb of stars inside his head, and he felt the rough floor grinding his face. He awoke with flickering light in his eyes. There was a small bronze lamp burning on a stool close to him. He was lying on the dirt floor of the hut. When he tried to move, he found that his wrists and ankles were bound to pegs driven into the packed earth. Sickening pain racked his head, and he sank back. There was a rustle of movement, and Bagaz Hoy crouched down beside him. The Valkesian's moon face was expressive of sympathy, as he held a clay cup of water to Kars's lips. I struck too hard, I'm afraid. But then, in the dark, with an armed man, one has to be careful. Do you feel like talking now? Kars looked up at him. An old habit made him control the rage that shook him. About what? He asked. Bagaz said, I am a frank and truthful man. When I saved you from the mob out there, my only idea was to rob you. Kars saw that his jeweled belt and collar had been transferred to Bagaz, who wore them both around his neck. The Valkesian now raised a plump hand and fingered them lovingly. Then, he continued, I got a closer look at that. He nodded toward the jeweled sword that leaned against the stool, shimmering in the lamplight. Now many men would examine it and see only a handsome sword. But I, Bagaz, am a man of education. I recognize the symbols on that blade. He leaned forward. Where did you get it? A warning instinct made Kars lie readily. I bought it from a trader. Bagaz shook his head. No, you didn't. There are spots of corrosion on the blade, scales of dust in the carvings. The hilt has not been polished. No trader would sell it in that condition. No, my friend, that sword has lain a long time in the dark, in the tomb of him who owned it. The tomb of Rhiannon. Kars lay without moving, looking at Bagaz. He did not like what he saw. The Valkesian had a kind and merry face. He would be excellent company over a bottle of wine. He would love a man like a brother, and regret exceedingly the necessity of cutting out his heart. Kars schooled his expression into sullen blankness. It may be Rhiannon's sword for all I know. Nevertheless, I bought it from a trader. The mouth of Bagaz, which was small and pink, puckered, and he shook his head. He reached out and patted Kar's cheek.
Please don't lie to me, friend. It upsets me to be lied to.
I'm not lying, Kar said. Listen, you have the sword. You have my ornaments. You have all you can get out of me. Just be satisfied. Bagaz sighed. He looked down appealingly at Kars.
Have you no gratitude? Didn't I save your life?
Kars said sardonically, It was a noble gesture.
It was indeed. If I'm caught for it, my life won't be worth that.
He snapped his fingers.
I cheated the mob of a moment's pleasure, and it wouldn't do a bit of good to tell them that you really aren't a Khand at all.
He let that fall very casually, but he watched Kars shrewdly from under his fat eyelids. Kars looked back at him, hard-eyed, and his face showed nothing.
What gave you that idea?
Bagaz laughed.
No Khand would be ass enough to show his face in Jakara to begin with, and especially if he'd found the lost secret all Mars has hunted for an age, the secret of the tomb of Rhiannon.
Kars's face moved no muscle, but he was thinking swiftly.
So the tomb was a lost mystery in this time, as in his own future time.
He shrugged. I know nothing of Rhiannon or his tomb. Bagaz squatted down on the floor beside Kars and smiled down at him like one humoring a child who wishes to play.
My friend, you are not being honest with me. There's no man on Mars who doesn't know that the Quiru long, long ago left our world because of what Rhiannon, the cursed one among them, had done. And all men know they built a secret tomb before they left, in which they locked Rhiannon and his powers. Is it wonderful that men should covet the powers of the gods? Is it strange that ever since men have hunted that lost tomb? And now that you have found it, do I, Bagaz, blame you for wanting to keep the secret to yourself?
He patted Kars's shoulder and beamed.
It is but natural on your part. But the secret of the tomb is too big for you to handle. You need my brains to help you. Together, with that secret, we can take what we want of Mars.
Kars said without emotion, You're crazy. I have no secret. I bought the sword from a traitor. Bagaz stared at him for a long moment. He stared very sadly. Then he sighed heavily.
Think, my friend, wouldn't it be better to tell me than to make me force it out of you?
There's nothing to tell, Kars said harshly. He did not wish to be tortured, but that odd warning instinct had returned more strongly. Something deep within him warned him not to tell the secret of the tomb. And anyway, even if he told, the fat Valkesian was likely to kill him than to prevent him from telling anyone else the secret. Bagaz sorrowfully shrugged fat shoulders.
You force me to extreme measures, and I hate that. I'm too chicken-hearted for this work. But, if it's necessary...
He was reaching into his belt pouch for something, when suddenly both men heard a sound of voices in the alleyway outside and the tramp of heavily shod feet. Outside, a voice cried,
There! That is the sty of the Bagaz hog!
A fist began to hammer on the door with such force that the small room rang like the inside of a drum.
Open up there, fat scum of Vulcus!
Heavy shoulders began to heave against the door.
Gods of Mars, groaned Bagaz. That Sark press gang has tracked us down.
He grabbed up the sword of Rhiannon and was in the act of hiding it in his bed when the warped planks of the door gave under the tremendous beating, and a spate of armed men burst into the room. 5. Slave of Sark. Bagaz recovered himself with magnificent aplomb. He bowed deeply to the leader of the press gang, a huge black-bearded, hawk-nosed man wearing the same black mail that Kars had seen on the Sark soldiers in the square.
"My lord child," said Bagaz, "I regret that I am corpulent and therefore slow of motion. I would not for worlds have given your lordship the trouble of breaking my poor door, especially—"
his face beamed with the light of pure innocence,
"especially as I was about to set out in search of you."
He gestured toward Kars.
"I have him for you, you see," he said. "I have him safe."
Child set his fists on his hips, thrust his spade beard up into the air, and laughed. Behind him, the soldiers of the press gang took it up, and behind them, the rabble of Jakarans who had come to see the fun.
"He has him safe," said Child. "For us."
More laughter. Child stepped closer to Bagaz.
"I suppose," he said, "that it was your loyalty that prompted you to spirit this conned dog away from my men in the first place."
"My lord," protested Bagaz,
"the mob would have killed him."
"That's why my men went in. We wanted him alive. A dead Khand is of no use to us. But you had to be helpful, Bagaz. Fortunately, you were seen." He reached out and fingered the stolen ornaments that Bagaz wore around his neck.
"Yes," said Child, "very fortunately."
He wrenched the collar and the belt away, admired the play of light on the jewels, and dropped them into his belt pouch. Then he moved to the bed, where the sword lay half concealed among the blankets. He picked it up, felt the weight and balance of the blade, examined casually the chasing of the steel, and smiled.
"A real weapon," he said, "beautiful as the lady herself, and just as deadly."
He used the point to cut Kars free of his bonds.
"Up, Khand," he said,
and helped him with the toe of his heavy sandal. Kars staggered to his feet and shook his head once to clear it. Then, before the men of the press gang could grasp him, he smashed his hard fist savagely into the expansive belly of Bagaz. Child laughed. He had a deep, hearty seaman's laugh. He kept guffawing as his soldiers pulled Kars away from the doubled-up, gasping Valkesian.
"No need for that now," Child told him. "There's plenty of time. You two are going to see a lot of each other."
Kars watched a horrible realization break over the fat face of Bagaz.
"My lord,"
quavered the Valkesian, still gasping,
"I am a loyal man. I wish only to serve the interests of Sark and Her Highness, the Lady Owain."
He bowed.
"Naturally," said Child. "And how could you better serve both Sark and the Lady Owain than by pulling an oar in her war galley?"
Bagaz was losing color by the second.
"But, my lord—"
"What?" cried Child fiercely.
"You protest? Where is your loyalty, Bagaz?"
He raised the sword.
"You know what the penalty is for treason?"
The men of the press gang were near to bursting with suppressed laughter.
"Nay,"
said Bagaz hoarsely.
"I am loyal. No one can accuse me of treason. I wish only to serve—"
He stopped short, apparently realizing that his own tongue had trapped him neatly. Child brought the flat of the blade down in a tremendous thwack across Bagaz's enormous buttocks.
"Go then and serve," he shouted.
Bagaz leaped forward, howling. The press gang grabbed him. In a few seconds, they had shackled him and Kars securely together. Child complacently thrust the sword of Rhiannon into his own sheath, after tossing his own blade to a soldier to carry. He led the way swaggeringly out of the hut. Once again, Kars made a pilgrimage through the streets of Jakara, but this time by night and in chains, stripped of his jewels and his sword. It was to the palace quays they went, and the cold, shivering thrill of unreality came again upon Kars, as he looked at the high towers ablaze with light, and the soft white fires of the sea that glowed far out in the darkness. The whole palace quarter swarmed with slaves, with men-at-arms and the sable mail of Sark, with courtiers and women and jongleurs. Music and the sounds of revelry came from the palace itself as they passed beneath it. Bagaz spoke to Kars in a rapid undertone.
The blockheads didn't recognize that sword. Keep quiet about your secret, or they'd take us both to Caerdu for questioning, and you know what that means.
He shuddered over all his great body. Kars was too numbed to answer. Reaction from this incredible world and from sheer physical fatigue was sweeping over him like a wave. Bagaz continued loudly for the benefit of their guards.
All this splendor is in honor of the Lady Owain of Sark, a princess as great as her father, King Gerach. To serve in her galley will be a privilege.
Child laughed mockingly.
Well said, Valkesian, and your fervent loyalty shall be rewarded. That privilege will be yours a long time.
The black war galley loomed up before them, their destination. Kars saw that it was long, rakish, with a rower's pit splitting its deck down the middle and a low stern castle aft. Flambeaux were blazing on the low poop deck back there, and ruddy light spilled from the windows of the cabins beneath it. Sark's soldiers clustered back there, chaffing each other loudly. But in the long, dark rower's pit, there was only a bitter silence. Child raised his bull voice in a shout.
Ho there, Callus!
A large man came grunting out of the shadowy pit, negotiating the catwalk with practiced skill. His right hand clutched a leathern bottle, and his left a black whip, a long-lashed thing, supple from much using. He saluted Child with the bottle, not troubling to speak.
Fodder for the benches, Child said. Take them.
He chuckled.
And see that they're chained to the same oar.
Callus looked at Kars and Bagaz, then smiled lazily and gestured with the bottle.
Get aft, carrion.
He grunted and let the lash run out. Kars glared at him out of red eyes and snarled. Bagaz gripped the Earthman by the shoulder and shook him.
Come on, fool, he said. We'll get enough beatings without you asking for them.
He pulled Kars with him, down into the rower's pit, and forward along the catwalk between the benches. The Earthman, numbed by shock and exhaustion, was only dimly aware of faces turned to watch them, of the mutter of chains and the smell of the bilges. He only half saw the round, curious heads of the two furry creatures who slept on the catwalk and who moved to let them pass. The last starboard bench facing the stern castle had only one sleeping man chained to its oar, its other two places being empty. The press gang stood by until Kars and Bagaz were safely chained. Then they went off with Child. Callus cracked his whip with a sound like a gunshot, apparently as a reminder to all hands, and went forward. Bagaz nudged Kars in the ribs. Then he leaned over and shook him. But Kars was beyond caring what Bagaz had to say. He was sound asleep, doubled over the loom of the oar. Kars dreamed. He dreamed that he was again taking that nightmare plunge through the shrieking infinities of the dark bubble in Rhiannon's tomb. He was falling, falling. And again, he had that sensation of a strong, living presence close beside him in the awful plunge, of something grasping at his brain with a dark and dreadful eagerness.
No,
Kars whispered in his dream.
No.
He husked that refusal again, a refusal of something that the dark presence was asking him to do, something veiled and frightful. But the pleading became more urgent, more insistent, and whatever it was that pleaded seemed now far stronger than in the tomb of Rhiannon. Kars uttered a shuddering cry.
No, Rhiannon!
He found himself suddenly awake, looking dazedly along the moonlit oarbank. Callus and the overseer were striding along the catwalk, lashing the slaves to wakefulness. Bagaz was looking at Kars with a strange expression.
"You cried out to the cursed one," he said.
The other slave at their oar was staring at him too, and so were the luminous eyes of the two furry shadows chained to the catwalk.
"A bad dream," Kars muttered. That was all.
He was interrupted by a whistle and crack, and a searing pain along his back.
"Stand to your oar, carrion,"
roared Callus's voice from above him. Kars voiced a tigerish cry, but Bagaz instantly stopped his mouth with one big paw.
"Steady," he warned. "Steady."
Kars got hold of himself, but not in time to avoid another stroke of the whip. Callus stood grinning down at him.
"You'll want care," he said. "Care and watching."
Then he lifted his head and yelled along the oar-bank.
"All right, you scum, you carrion. Sit up to it. We're starting on the tide for Sock, and I'll flay alive the first man who loses stroke."
Overhead, seamen were busy in the rigging. The sails fell wide from the yards, dark in the moonlight. There was a sudden pregnant silence along the ship, a drawing of breath and tightening of sinews. On a platform at the end of the catwalk, a slave crouched ready over a great hide drum. An order was given. The fist of the drummer clenched and fell. All along the oar-bank, the great sweeps shot out, found water, bit and settled to a steady rhythm. The drumbeat gave the time, and the lash enforced it. Somehow, Kars and Bagaz managed to do what they had to do. The rower's pit was too deep for sight, except what one could glimpse through the oar-ports. But Kars heard the full-throated cheer of the crowd on the quays, as the war galley of Owain of Sark cleared the slip, standing out into the open harbor. The night breeze was light, and the sails drew little. The drum picked up the beat, drove it faster, sent the long sweeps swinging, and set the scarred and sweating backs of the slaves to their full stretch and strain. Kars felt the lift of the hull to the first swell of the open sea. Through the oarport, he glimpsed a heaving ocean of milky flame. He was bound for Sark across the white sea of Mars.